This is a story that my grandmother told me years ago, one that she swore was true. It happened back in the summer of 1985 in a small town called Hollow Creek, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Hollow Creek was a quiet place where everyone knew each other and life moved slowly. But that summer, something terrifying occurred, something that left the town haunted forever. My grandmother was a teenager at the time, and she had a group of close friends, Maggie, Chris, and Tom. One hot, sticky afternoon, they decided to explore an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The house had belonged to a man named John Whitaker, who had mysteriously disappeared during a massive thunderstorm over a decade earlier. The locals had long whispered about the house being cursed, especially during storms, but the group of friends dismissed it as mere superstition. As the sun began to set, dark clouds started rolling in, and the air grew heavy with the promise of a storm. Despite the impending weather, the group pressed on, eager for the thrill of exploring the supposedly haunted house. When they arrived, the sky was a deep shade of purple, and the first distant rumbles of thunder could be heard. The house looked even more ominous up close with its broken windows and sagging roof, but they ignored their unease and entered. The interior was just as they expected, dusty, decrepit, and filled with the remnants of a life long forgotten. They split up to explore, joking and laughing to keep the tension at bay. But as the storm outside grew closer, the atmosphere inside the house changed. The air grew colder, and the once faint sounds of thunder became deafening roars, shaking the very walls of the house. Maggie was the first to notice something was wrong. As she wandered into the living room, she saw that one of the windows was shattered, the glass on the floor strangely clean as if it had just broken. She felt a chill run down her spine, and the hair on the back of her neck stood up. She called out to the others, but her voice was drowned out by a sudden, violent crack of thunder. Chris, who was upstairs in one of the bedrooms, claimed he heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned around, there was no one there. The room had grown unnaturally cold, and the shadows seemed to shift and move on their own. He hurried downstairs, his heart pounding, to find Tom and Maggie huddled together in the hallway. Tom had his own unsettling experience. He had found a series of old photographs in the kitchen, but the faces in the pictures were blurred, almost as if they had been scratched out. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, and the sound of the storm outside only heightened his fear. The three of them quickly decided it was time to leave, but when they tried to find the front door, it was gone. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways it hadn't before. Panicked, they ran back to the living room where they had entered, only to find that the room had changed. The furniture was no longer covered in dust, and the broken window was whole again. But there was something else. A figure stood in the corner, shrouded in darkness. They couldn't make out any features, but they could feel its eyes on them. As the storm outside reached its peak, with lightning flashing and thunder shaking the house, the figure began to move toward them. The three friends screamed and ran, desperate to find a way out. Just as they thought they were trapped, the front door reappeared, and they burst through it into the torrential rain. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of Chris's house, drenched and shaking with fear. When they tried to explain what had happened to their parents, no one believed them, dismissing it as overactive imaginations fueled by the storm. But they knew what they had seen, what they had felt. The next morning, they went back to the house, hoping to find some rational explanation for the night before. But when they arrived, they found the house burned to the ground, nothing but ashes and rubble remaining. There were no signs of the figure they had seen, but they knew that whatever it was still out there, waiting for the next storm to bring it back. To this day, the story of the thunderstorm at Hollow Creek is told in the town, a chilling reminder of the night the storm brought something evil into their lives. And every time a storm rolls in, the residents lock their doors and pray that the darkness doesn't find its way back into their homes. In the remote wilderness of Oregon, there's an old weathered cabin known as Pine Ridge Cabin. For decades, it's been a place of refuge for hunters and hikers, but it also carries a dark reputation. Local legends speak of strange occurrences, eerie lights, and whispers that float on the wind. But those are just stories, right? In the fall of 1998, I decided to spend a weekend at Pine Ridge Cabin with my three closest friends, Mark, Lisa, and Jake. We were drawn by the promise of adventure and the beauty of the surrounding forest, but also by the thrill of staying in a place with a creepy past. The trip began like any other. We hiked during the day and settled into the cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first night was uneventful, filled with laughter, stories around the fireplace, and the comfort of good company. But on the second night, things began to change. As we sat around the fire, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the cabin creak and groan. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, and an unsettling feeling settled in the room. I was the first to notice something off. I thought I saw movement outside the window, just beyond the firelight's reach. A shadow, too tall and too thin to be a person, seemed to dart between the trees. I shook it off as a trick of the light and didn't mention it to the others. Later that night, as we prepared for bed, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense. The wind outside was relentless, battering the walls as if trying to force its way in. The creaks and groans of the old wood seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I could feel something in the air, a presence that hadn't been there before. Unable to sleep, I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like a voice carried on the breeze. It was faint, just at the edge of hearing, but it was there. My heart raced as I strained to make out the words, but they were too quiet, too distorted by the wind. I sat up, holding my breath, trying to listen more closely. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, but still incomprehensible. I glanced over at the others. Mark was out cold, and Lisa and Jake seemed restless, but unaware of the sound. I thought about waking them, but hesitated, not wanting to seem paranoid. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence. Even the wind seemed to die down, leaving the cabin in an eerie stillness. My heart pounded in the silence, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Just as I began to relax, thinking I might have imagined the whole thing, there was a loud thump from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. My blood ran cold. The steps were slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth just outside the door. I held my breath, listening, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But the footsteps were too heavy, too purposeful for any animal. I could feel the floor vibrating with each step, and the terror grew with every passing second. The doorknob rattled, sending me into a full-blown panic. I leaped out of bed and grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. The others woke up, startled by my sudden movement. "What's wrong?" Mark asked groggily, rubbing his eyes. "Shh," I hissed, motioning for them to be quiet. The doorknob rattled again, more violently this time, as if something was trying to force its way inside. We stood frozen, staring at the door, the only barrier between us and whatever was outside. The footsteps continued, moving along the porch, pausing at the windows as if inspecting each one. "Should we check it out?" Jake whispered, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "Are you insane?" Lisa shot back, her voice trembling. "We need to barricade the door." We quickly moved furniture against the door, anything we could find to reinforce it. As we worked, the footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to fill the entire cabin. We held our breath, waiting, listening, but there was nothing. No wind, no footsteps, no whispering, just silence. For what felt like hours, we stood there, weapons in hand, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the exhaustion caught up with us, and we slumped down, too scared to sleep, but too tired to stay alert. The next morning, the first light of dawn crept through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. We cautiously opened the door, expecting to find signs of whatever had terrorized us during the night, but there was nothing. No footprints, no damage, no indication that anything had been there at all. We packed up and left as quickly as we could, not daring to spend another night at Pine Ridge Cabin. As we hiked back to civilization, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if it too was holding its breath. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night, whether it was our imagination, a prank, or something far more sinister. All I know is that we weren't alone in that cabin, and whatever was out there in the dark is something I never want to encounter again.